All right, buckle up for this one, folks. We're going deep today. It is some seriously strange territory. We've got two sources that, on the surface, seem completely unrelated. One is a YouTube video. It's called Satanism and PSYOPS, The World of Michael Aquino. It's from a channel called The Last Sitcom. And the other one, well, it's about snuff films. That one's from a channel called, I'm not making this up, Flesh Simulator. The video is serial killing for fun and profit, the secret history of the American snuff film industry. So we're going deep into alleged satanic psyops and the underbelly of a snuff film ring. What possible connection could there be? Well, let's find out.
What's fascinating about these sources is that they both explore power dynamics and the darker aspects of human behavior. One focuses on a man who allegedly tried to weaponize the mind, and the other, well, it dives into a world where human life is treated as a commodity.
Okay, so let's start with this Michael Aquino character. The YouTube video paints a pretty wild picture. This guy wasn't just some weekend occultist. We're talking a former lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army who founded the Temple of Set, which is a satanic organization. And apparently it even split off from the Church of Satan.
Right. It's important to understand that distinction. The Church of Satan, founded by Anton LaVey, is actually atheistic. They see Satan as a symbol of rebellion and individualism, not a literal deity.
Yeah. Now, you might be surprised to learn that there are different types of Satanism. Aquino's version was very different from the Church of Satan, which actually doesn't believe in Satan as a literal being. They see him more as a symbol of rebellion. But Aquino, he was deep into the occult. He even had a dagger that allegedly belonged to an SS general involved in black magic research during World War II.
And this interest in the occult wasn't just a personal hobby for Aquino. It seems to have influenced his professional life as well. He wrote an essay titled From PSYOP to Mind War, The Psychology of Victory, in which he proposed a new form of psychological warfare he called mind war.
Mind war. Okay, now we're getting into some seriously sci-fi territory.
Essentially, he argued that traditional psychological operations were too limited. He wanted to go beyond just influencing what people think, to actually controlling their very perceptions and emotions.
So like brainwashing.
In a sense, yes. He envisioned using technology and psychological techniques to essentially reprogram people's minds.
Hold on. He thought we could use this mind war on our own citizens. That's a bit unsettling.
It is. He believed that mind war could be used on anyone, including American citizens, to achieve political and military objectives.
I mean, I can see how psychological operations could be useful in war, but using them on your own people, that doesn't sound very ethical to me.
It's a morally complex issue, to say the least. Aquino argued that mind war could be a more humane and cost-effective way to achieve certain goals, but the potential for abuse is undeniable.
Okay, so this guy was a Satanist, a military strategist, and he had some pretty radical ideas about psychological warfare.
Yeah.
Anything else we should know about Michael Aquino before we move on?
Well, there were also accusations of child abuse leveled against him. While he was stationed at the Presidio, he maintained his innocence and was never charged or convicted.
So a controversial figure, to say the least. A real mix of intrigue and, honestly, some disturbing stuff. But before we get too deep into the ethical implications of mind war, let's switch gears and talk about our second source, the one about snuff films. Now, before we get too far into this, maybe we should clarify what a snuff film actually is, just so everyone's on the same page.
A snuff film is a recording of a real murder, typically committed for the purpose of entertainment or financial gain. It's a concept that has been shrouded in rumor and urban legend for decades. Still, there have been confirmed cases of snuff films existing.
Okay, so we're dealing with some truly dark material here. And our source suggests that this isn't just about isolated incidents. There's a whole network involved in producing and distributing these films.
The video delves into the story of Dean Corll, a serial killer in Houston, Texas, responsible for the torture and murder of at least 28 young men and teenage boys. His accomplices, Elmer Wayne Henley and David Owen Brooks, helped lure victims and participated in the killings.
That's horrifying.
Yeah.
So how does this connect to a larger snuff film network?
Well, according to the video, Corll's crimes were allegedly just one part of a much larger operation. We're talking about a web of connections that supposedly involved organized crime, powerful individuals, and potentially even a link to a government program called Project Delta in Chicago.
Wait, a government program? This is getting more and more unsettling.
It is. The source material claims that Project Delta was involved in mind control experiments, and that there may have been a connection to the production of snuff films.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. We got this Michael Aquino guy who believes in controlling minds through mind war. And now we have a source claiming a government program was involved in mind control experiments and potentially snuff films. Could there be a connection?
It's certainly tempting to draw a direct line between those two ideas. But it's important to remember that our sources don't explicitly establish that link. We're dealing with a lot of speculation and alleged connections.
Right, right. We don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. But it's hard not to see the parallels, This idea of mind war, of controlling people's thoughts and perceptions. It feels like a natural progression to the kind of dehumanization and exploitation we see in the snuff film world.
I understand that feeling. Both stories tap into a primal fear of manipulation, of losing control of our own minds and bodies.
So let's go back to this snuff film network. You mentioned Dean Carl and his accomplices, but the source video suggests there were many more people involved.
That's right. The video names several individuals who were allegedly part of this network, people involved in child pornography distribution, the production of these films, and even some who had connections to organized crime. One name that stands out is John Norman. He was arrested multiple times for child pornography offenses and was associated with figures like Roy Ames and Adam Starchild, formerly known as Robert McConaughey.
These names. It's like stepping into a shadow world, a place where the rules of normal society don't apply.
It's a disturbing glimpse into a subculture, where the exploitation of children and the commodification of violence are normalized.
And this network, it wasn't just some small-time operation. The video claims there were connections to powerful people, maybe even government agencies.
The video mentions a figure named Gerald Richards, who testified about the existence of several organizations involved in child exploitation, including Brother Paul's Children's Mission, Odyssey, Troop 137, and Father Bud's Boys Farm. These names might sound innocuous, but Richards alleged they were fronts for a vast network of abuse.
So it wasn't just a few bad apples. This was something much bigger, much more organized.
That's the implication, yes. And the video even suggests a possible link to Project Delta, which, if true, raises questions about the potential involvement of government agencies in these activities.
This is getting really heavy. It's hard to even process the idea that something like this could exist on such a large scale.
I understand. It's a lot to take in. But it's important to remember that this information comes from a single source. And while it's presented as a deep dive into a hidden world, it's essential to approach it with a critical eye.
Right, of course. We're not saying any of this is definitively true. But even the possibility that it could be, it's chilling.
It is. And it raises some uncomfortable questions about the nature of power, corruption, and the lengths some individuals will go to exploit and control others.
So what happened to these people? Did they ever face justice?
According to the source video, many of the individuals named were eventually arrested and convicted. John Norman, for example, died in a state hospital after being repeatedly incarcerated for child pornography offenses. Gerald Richards, who bravely testified about the network, tragically died by suicide in 1998.
It's some kind of twisted justice, I guess, but it doesn't erase the harm that was done. And it makes you wonder how many other victims there were, how many other abusers might have escaped justice.
It's a disturbing thought, and it underscores the importance of vigilance and continued efforts to expose and combat child exploitation and abuse.
As we're talking about this, I can't help but think about the victims. Their stories are often lost in the sensationalism surrounding these cases.
That's an important point. It's crucial to remember that behind these headlines, behind these allegations, are real people who have suffered unimaginable trauma.
We can't let their stories be forgotten. And we can't let the focus on the perpetrators overshadow the need for justice and healing for the victims.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that this isn't just some abstract concept we're discussing. It's about real lives, real pain, and the need for accountability.
So where does this leave us? We've explored these two seemingly disparate worlds, Michael Aquino's mind war theories and the dark underbelly of the snuff film industry. We've talked about potential connections, about the abuse of power, and about the importance of remembering the victims. But I'm still struggling to wrap my head around it all. It feels like we've just scratched the surface of something much larger, much more complex.
That's a common reaction when exploring these kinds of topics. It can feel overwhelming, disorienting even. But I think it's important to sit with that discomfort, to acknowledge the darkness without letting it consume us.
So what should we take away from this? What's the message, the lesson in all of this?
I think the key takeaway is that we need to be aware of the potential for evil, both in individuals and in systems. We need to be critical thinkers, to question what we see and hear, and to hold those in power accountable.
And to remember that the pursuit of power, whether it's through mind control, violence, or exploitation, can lead to truly horrific consequences.
Exactly. And that we have a responsibility to speak out against injustice, to protect the vulnerable, and to strive for a world where these kinds of atrocities are no longer possible.
I feel like we've covered so much ground, but at the same time, there's still so much more to explore. It's like we've opened Pandora's box, and all these disturbing truths have come spilling out.
That's a powerful analogy, and it speaks to the inherent danger in seeking knowledge, in peering behind the curtain of accepted reality.
But isn't that what this deep dive is all about? To confront uncomfortable truths, to challenge our assumptions,
Yeah.
and to grapple with the complexities of the world.
It is. And while it can be unsettling, it's also an essential part of growth and understanding.
Okay, ready to dive back into this. We've talked about the potential connections between these two stories. But there's one question we haven't fully addressed. Is there any concrete evidence linking Michael Aquino to the Snuff film network we've been discussing?
Based on the sources we have, there's no direct evidence linking Aquino to the specific Snuff film network we've discussed.
So no smoking gun. But it's hard to ignore the thematic connections, right? I mean, we're talking about manipulation, exploitation, and a complete disregard for human life in both cases.
You're right. Both stories highlight the dark potential of human nature and the dangers of unchecked power. Whether it's seeking to control minds through psychological warfare or exploiting and harming others for profit, there's a common thread of dehumanization that runs through both narratives.
And the fact that both stories involve individuals in positions of authority, Aquino in the military, and those alleged connections to government agencies in the Snuff film network, it just makes you question who you can trust.
It definitely shakes our faith in the institutions that are supposed to protect us. These stories remind us that power can be corrupted, and that even those in positions of authority are capable of terrible things.
It's a sobering thought. And it makes me wonder, are these just isolated incidents? Or are they symptoms of a deeper societal problem? I mean, what kind of world allows for these kinds of things to happen?
That's a big question, and one that's difficult to answer definitively, but I think it's important to examine the cultural factors that might contribute to these kinds of atrocities.
Like what, specifically?
Well, think about the way violence is often glamorized in our media. The desensitization to suffering that can come from constant exposure to disturbing images, and the way our society often values power and control above compassion and empathy. These are all factors that can create a climate where exploitation and abuse can thrive.
It's almost like we're being conditioned to accept a certain level of violence and dehumanization as normal.
It's a disturbing thought, but one worth considering. We need to be critical of the messages we're receiving from our culture and be mindful of the ways in which we might be contributing to these problems, even unintentionally.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. It's not just about these two specific stories. It's about the forces that shape our values, our perceptions, and ultimately, our actions.
Exactly. And while it's easy to feel powerless in the face of these larger forces, we can make choices that push back against these negative trends.
So what can we do? I mean, how do we fight against something as pervasive as a culture of violence and exploitation?
It starts with awareness. We need to educate ourselves about these issues, be critical of the media we consume, and support organizations that are working to combat these problems.
And what about on a personal level? What can we do in our own lives to make a difference?
We can start by being more mindful of our own actions and interactions. We can choose kindness over cruelty, empathy over indifference, and challenge those who perpetuate harmful attitudes and behaviors.
So it's about individual responsibility as much as it is about systemic change.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and compassionate world.
You know, as we're wrapping up this deep dive, I'm struck by the contrast between the darkness we've explored and the hope that you're expressing. It's like we've journeyed into the heart of darkness, but we've emerged with a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to fight for the light.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And I think it's a reminder that even in the face of great evil, the human spirit is resilient. We have the capacity for both darkness and light. And it's up to us to choose which path we will follow.
Well said. And to our listener, we hope this deep dive has challenged you, informed you, and maybe even inspired you to take action. Remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about the world, the better equipped we are to make it a better place.
And never underestimate the power of your own voice and actions. Even small acts of kindness and courage can make a difference.
That's a great note to end on. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay hopeful.